Here we are, finding the ground of values in a postmodern world. So you might wonder, well, what's that all about? And so a good place to start is looking at trying to understand what this postmodern means. And to understand postmodern's after the modern period, and obviously that before that's what people call a pre-modern period. So if we have a look at the pre-modern period, it's not so much a matter of chronology, it's more sort of cultural thing. So this would have been during the time of the Middle Ages, right up until basically the period of the Renaissance, when it was Europe, the world in which we're living, anyway, talking more about Europe, was monocultural. Everybody was a Christian. There was no alternative. The only people who encountered an alternative were people who went to the Crusades, and they would encounter Islam. But generally speaking, most people, they were just born to be a Christian, and they didn't have a choice. They didn't have people coming around the villages and the towns, witnessing to them, giving an alternative way of looking at the world, an alternative way of understanding the world. So they were just born, lived, and died a Christian, and that was just the way it was. That was
that in Europe?
Yes.
Europe.
Yeah, but also you could say the same in yeah. Sorry.
America.
Was it? Some parts, not really.
Oh, but not been lately.
I'm basically interested in that period here in Europe, trying to because basically we're talking about the development of European culture, philosophy, and civilization. And so I said there's one religion. There's one religion or denomination. People were Catholics. People were aware there was another church, the Orthodox Church, but they didn't know anything about it, and they were just Catholic and believing in the Pope. And there's one. And if they were lucky to get a Bible, there's only one correct reading of the text. And this was determined by the magisterium of the church. And so if you deviated from your interpretation of the Bible or the text, or you didn't believe the right thing, you could find yourself being accused of heresy, and even worse, you could find yourself being persecuted and even put to death. So there was only one way to read the text, and that was it. And so then you had one set of values, one set of beliefs. And this has basically been the way that Christianity has developed up until today. And so during the early part of the church, they formulated a creed, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, the Chaldean Creed, to narrow it down more and more what it was that you had to believe if you were going to call yourself a Christian. And if you didn't believe this, this, and this, and this, and this, and this, then you were no longer called a Christian, and you would have to leave the Roman Empire, or you could be punished. So one set of values, one set of beliefs, and in that sense it's like a meta-narrative of the creation of the world. There's the fall, there's the history, there's Jesus came, the incarnation, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and then the expectation of the second coming, Christ coming back on the clouds. This huge kind of big story in which they found themselves and in which they interpreted the world in which they lived. Now that was the story. And all this then was enforced by the church, and also the church had co-opted the power of the state, and the state then was used to persecute heretics. So you could say that was a pre-modern world.
So the Roman Empire ended up believing in Jesus?
People living in the Roman Empire did, yes.
First. There is a missing link somewhere for me.
It's okay, how you got there. I'm just skipping over this. I'm not going through the whole historical process. This is just how it ended up in the Middle Ages. And yeah, certainly this church-state thing was very important for the whole of European history. Anyway, then we enter what we often call the modern age. You might think, well, that's the 20th century, but actually this period really started with the Renaissance. And with the Renaissance came the introduction into Italy, primarily, of lots of Greek texts from the New Testament. And so people like Erasmus and scholars, they started studying these Greek versions of the Bible, and they realized there were quite a few different ones. And also they realized there's a difference between the original Greek text and the Latin translation that they'd only been able to read up until then. And so this interest then in the text became very intense for the whole, up until today, within European philosophy. And of course, you know, if you have one text here and another text here, and they're not exactly the same, then of course, well, okay, if this is the Word of God, which version is the Word of God? Yeah? Which version is the true Word of God, the true text? Did Jesus say exactly this, or did he say exactly that? And so this then raises all kinds of questions, and people tend to start questioning the text, which is the Word of God. If you start questioning the text, you also start questioning authority. Okay, maybe the different texts, maybe there are a variety of different ways of interpreting this. And so this led, with the Renaissance, then, to a whole renewal of European culture. And as this attempt at renewal came along, it sparked off the Reformation, and with Martin Luther, who disagreed with practices of the Catholic Church because he said he couldn't find any evidence to support those practices or indulgences in the Bible, in the text. And so he said to the representative of the Pope, if you can justify what the Pope is teaching or what the practices, the indulgences are from the biblical text, I'll go along with it. And so again, it's this whole thing going back to the Bible. The Bible then is the fundamental Word of God. And of course, the issue then is so up until then you had the magisterium, you had the Catholic Church interpreting the Bible, the one true and correct interpretation. So once you ditch the Catholic Church and the magisterium as a source of authority for pronouncing what the correct interpretation is, then you've just got the text. So how, and then you've got different people praying, guided by the Holy Spirit, to interpret the text, but they come up with different interpretations. And as soon as you start getting different interpretations, people start arguing and fighting about it, and each starts accusing each other of heresy, and so you get this division. And so you get this incredible fragmentation within Protestantism, each still thinking there's only one correct interpretation, and it happens to be their interpretation. And so people just falling out with each other left, right, and center. Still stuck with this idea there's only one correct interpretation. So then, of course, there's obviously then more than one way. People start wondering, well, which is the correct way? And then this thing comes along where before people were just born, lived and died in their religion without questioning it. Suddenly people now had to, if they wanted to, they could choose. Oh, my parents are this, but actually there's a whole other, there's another church over there, another group. Maybe I can choose which one I want to adopt. And then, of course, with this, you've got the religious wars, the most devastating and destructive wars in the whole of European history were fought after the Reformation between Catholics and Protestants primarily, and everybody got involved. And it was devastating for Germany, and anyway, there we are. And so a lot of intelligent people, they start to become very skeptical about religion, because you've got all these intensely religious, fanatically religious people, incredibly devoted, killing each other in the name of God, and torturing each other in the name of God, and to save their souls. And so a lot of intelligent intellectuals, they became very, very skeptical, and they thought, you get this expression, religion causes wars, and this is sort of expression which has resonated through until today. This skepticism about religion because it's the cause of wars. It's because of what happened there. And so people became rather skeptical, and so we have to find an alternative basis for deciding what is true. You can't rely upon these religious fanatics to tell us what is the truth, because it's just based upon their particular interpretation of this revelation of the Bible. So we have to find an alternative source of truth, an alternative source of values, an alternative source of ethics. And so this then leads into what came known as Enlightenment. A lot of it was sparked because of the wars of religion. And so the Enlightenment then, people started questioning all traditions, questioning all texts. And so, a father would be, doing something, and his son would say, why are you doing it like this? And the father would say, because grandfather used to do it like this, and great-grandfather used to do it, etc., etc., etc. But why are you doing it? That's not a good enough reason to say you're doing it because that's what we've always done. Maybe there's a better way of doing it. Maybe there's an alternative way of doing it. And so instead of accepting things just on the basis of tradition, people wanted to have a better reason for accepting something. And so two basic sort of traditions that developed, along with the rejection of revelation at this time as a source of deciding what is right and wrong, came reason as the basis for knowledge. Okay, I accept this because it's rational, it's logical, it makes sense. It may be different to what it says in the Bible, but it's logical. And so that's the sort of rationalist tradition which developed, most strongly within France, with Baudin and then Descartes and the whole tradition. And they had another tradition, well, it works, which is based upon experience, and that led to the development of experience as a basis for knowledge, development of science, and empirical tradition, which developed primarily in Britain, in England and Scotland. And so you've got these two different sources of deciding what is right. Is it true? Yes, because I can do an experiment and it works, therefore the theory is true. Or yes, it's true because it's logical. And so when you look in the Bible then, it says in the Bible that that Joshua, in order to be able to finish the battle, he said a little prayer and the sun stopped moving in the skies. Okay, is that true or not? Has it ever stopped moving before? Is there a scientific explanation? Is it rational? So, and the whole thing about the miracles, is that rational? Do we see miracles going on today? And so huge amounts of the Bible then were discarded when you started to apply the standard of, is it logical, is it reasonable, or is it based upon, is it scientific? So it was a sort of modern age, and so with this then came the development of secularism. Yeah, so the desacralization of everyday life. So instead of everyday life being involved with God and God being involved in everything, why are the flowers blooming? Oh, because God created them so that we can be happy. Why is this? Because God's there, God's there. Everything was God infested. Yeah, but then gradually, well, actually we have a scientific explanation for that. We don't need God to explain that. We don't need God to explain that. We don't need to pray to cure someone, you just need to give them some medicine. So science then explained all that area and lots of different things. Oh, we don't need to go and see the priest for confession, you can go and see a psychiatrist instead. And so all these areas which were covered by the sort of spiritual, sacred realm, they all became secularized. God was taken out of these areas and they all became secular in that sense. So also the desacralization of the public space, and along with this the privatization of religion. So no, okay, that's what you believe, but it should just be a private matter. Go to church on Sunday, but don't bring it into the public space. Don't bring God into conversation. Don't bring God into politics. Don't bring God into the schools. Don't bring God into anything. Yeah, and then start having to take religious symbols out. So of course this is most extreme in France after the French Revolution, laïcité. Did I pronounce it correctly? Oh, good. At least I got. And this extreme separation of church and state. In Britain, it's still lots of pre-modern elements. Yeah? We still have bishops in the House of Lords. We still have prayers at the beginning of Parliament. The political, the landscape is divided based upon the parish as the smallest political unit, which is the parish church, and half the schools in the country are church schools. Religion is taught within schools. So it's a sort of lots of elements of the pre-modern era which are still in Britain, but they're just sort of gradually being squeezed out. People say it's a secular country, we shouldn't have bishops in the... so all these kind of conversations. So that's a sort of modern era, and then that feeds in then into capitalism, the market, the values. It's just decided by the market. God doesn't figure there. And then, as this develops, then into the 20th century, 19th century, becoming more and more like that. And the culmination in the 20th century, with fascism, communism, capitalism, these are sort of the outworkings of this extreme secularization and the consequences of it in the 20th century. So, of course, the outcome of modernity was not so great. So then you have this sort of postmodern era where people say, well, look, modernity gave us capitalism, exploitation, lots of people incredibly rich, a lot of people incredibly poor. It gave us fascism, which is supposed to be scientific, Nazism, which is supposed to be based upon eugenics, which is a scientific study of the race. Then you've got communism, which is based upon a planned society and scientific materialism, etc., etc. So the postmodernists said, well, actually, the outcomes weren't so great. So after the war, you had this incredible skepticism towards Enlightenment rationality because of what it led to, the world wars and the Holocaust in particular. And then also you had the growth of pluralism, so not only the many different religious Christian denominations, but also many other different religions started to appear, and people realized, there's a whole variety of ways in which you can look at the world, not just one. And as a result of that, it's very easy to fall into relativism. Okay, there's lots of different denominations, lots of different ways of looking at the world, lots of different religions. How can you say one is right and one is wrong? And so you get this sort of practical relativism in that sense. And then, as I said, also going back to the study of the text, is there a correct way of reading the text? Is there one way of reading the text which is the right one? And then, okay, there are a variety of ways of reading the text. Well, who's to say your way of reading the text is better than mine? Who's to say that your religion is better than my religion? Who's to say that your idea of right and wrong is better than my idea of right and wrong? So you get this sort of relativism, and then also this rejection of the meta-narrative, that there's any big narrative. The sort of secular meta-narrative was the idea of progress. Things are getting better and better and better with the development of science, but that was completely crunched with the world wars. Instead of progress, you got the First World War, you got the Second World War, and the consequences. So people rejected that overall meta-narrative of the age of progress. And so you have this critique then, with postmodernism, of universal values. Are they universal values? What do you think? Are they universal values?
Some.
Do you think so?
Really?
And this is a problem that came up in the newspaper. Well, it came up just recently, last week, I think.
Yeah.
I was listening to a conversation. Some people developing these self-driving cars, but then you have to program the software. So one of the problems with driving cars is there's also these things called human beings wandering around. And if you're a car driver, then you see a human being in front of you and you have to decide whether to run him over or not. All these decisions that have to be made. Okay, so a human being will make one set of decisions. Okay, so if you have a choice between running over a child and running over a dog, what would you do? You run over a dog, okay. Right. Between running over a child and running over an...
That's universal.
Not quite.
Not quite.
Okay, but let's just step it. Okay, yeah. Between not running over and killing a child and running over and killing an old person, what would you choose if you had to? Difficult, isn't it? But the point is, a car has to make these kind of choices. It recognizes there's a child in front of me, there's an old person in front of me. Recognize that. Well, that's right. So,
or I could kill myself.
Yeah, but the car has to. Well, that's right, but maybe that's not an option.
The software. Oh yes.
Maybe
I'm with you.
Maybe that's not an option to kill yourself. Maybe you don't have space to run into the lamppost. You just have to make a choice. Now, what would you choose?
Interesting. Very interesting.
Okay, so they did a survey then. So it's an ethical question. Who do you run over? So and they did a survey in the West. People said, I would run over the old person because the child has a future, they're young, that's the future, they haven't lived their life yet, they've still got the possibility of education and getting married, having their own children and everything. So you'd run over the old person and not go kill the old person because they've lived their life, they've had their kids, they've had this and this and this, and they're going to die in a few years anyway. Okay? But then they also surveyed people living in China and the Orient, and they said, no, we'd run over the child. Why? Well, because the child doesn't know anything. There's no wisdom, there's no knowledge there. The old person, they got so much wisdom and so much knowledge, so much more to contribute to society than the child. So then it becomes a problem. How do you program the car?
Interesting.
Program the car so that the situation will come.
Sorry?
You program the car so that this situation can occur.
Yeah, but you can't program human beings. That's the problem when they decide both of them to walk into the road in front of the car at the same time. These are the kind of problems. Are the universal values? Well, if there are, then whose are they?
But then maybe the old person is not so wise for walking into the road.
Sorry?
Maybe the old person is not so wise after all if he walked into the road.
Well, maybe they were just blind, or not looking where they're going, or they're just distracted thinking about their grandchildren, what can they get them from the shop, and they just step out in the road, and there happens to be a van coming along.
It freezes. Has to stop.
Anyway, so all I'm saying is, people say there's universal values. Okay, it's a very nice little soundbite, but are there really? In these kind of situations, it's very difficult. So, yeah, no universal values. Therefore, there's no universal morality. Mores are based on customs. The word morality comes from custom, mores, and lots of different customs go to different parts of the world. They have different customs, different morality, different tradition, a critique of reason, a critique of language, and progress, and it's a little critique of everything, basically. And also the study of language is very interesting, because it's got this idea that truth, there's no such thing as truth, because truth itself is all these things are all socially conditioned, such as the value of a human being. Whether you think a human being is of this value or that value depends upon where you've been brought up, depends upon your cultural assumptions. There's no absolute standard of whether a young or an old person is more valuable than the other. This is just entirely culturally determined. So is there such a thing then as truth or absolute values? And so this then, of course, comes from this whole issue of language. So again, this goes back to the text. So when people are starting to translate the text, so a lot of these issues came up with Christianity, most of them actually. It's to do with the text. This is the text. Okay, what language did Jesus speak? Well, I always used to think he spoke English, because whenever I read the book where he was speaking, he was always speaking in English.
It's true.
And it was a bit of a shock to me to actually find that, no, he didn't speak English. He spoke Aramaic, Hebrew. He probably did speak Greek, because it was a Greek-speaking world at that time. But then, so, the challenge then for translators of the Bible is when you translate from one language to another, it's impossible to have a perfect translation. So all of you here who are not English, you probably speak another language fluently. Pretty much. Is it possible to translate exactly from one language to another?
No.
It's impossible, isn't it?
Totally.
You just look in a dictionary, one word, and you have to choose between 5 or 6 words. There's no such thing as a perfect translation, because every language is a social construct. It reflects the society, the relationships, a way of looking at the world, a way of interpreting the world. All these things are contained within the particular language. So every language then is like a window to look at the world. And when you think in one language, your whole inner world is different. Your way of looking at the world is different. Your way of looking at relationships and relating is different compared to when you got the other bit of software running. Yeah? So is there an absolute you?
No.
Because who you are depends upon which bit of software you got running around in your head.
And sometimes you got all of them running around you.
Yeah, so that's the way it is. That's the nature of reality. And so then the point is, truth then is expressed in what? Language.
Yes.
But all languages are social constructs, and all languages are relative. So even if there is a truth, it's not possible to express the truth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's like a postmodern insight. Everything is an interpretation. There's no absolute language. The closest thing we have to an absolute language is what, do you think? What's the closest thing we have to an absolute language that can perfectly describe the nature of reality?
Oh.
Mathematics, yeah. Because seems to be an absolute correspondence between mathematics and the natural world. You can actually describe everything about the natural world using complex mathematics. Whereas you can't do that using any human language.
It's very beautiful, actually.
But
Wow.
so let's try and have a conversation using maths.
Well.
So apparently there's one way that, you know, comedians do it. They have a whole list of 100 jokes, and they number all the jokes. And one of them says number 7, and the other one remembers a joke and laughs. And they say, oh, I counted that with number 13, etc. Yeah, never mind. So, yeah. So,
Maths are not numbers. Maths are not numbers.
Anyway, I'm not going to talk about mathematics, arithmetic, yeah. So, no absolute language, all expressions are relative. And so, and then this comes in, and so a lot of these issues about the text, interpretation, and as I said, it happened within issues of translating the Bible. A lot of these issues arose. And then and you had these French philosophers, Derrida, Lyotard, who developed this sort of what you call deconstructing the text, and, you know, where does the text come from, and try to explain the sort of basic assumptions behind it. And this idea then that every translation, every reading of the text is an interpretation. And this is very clear. If you're in a little book reading group, you're reading a novel together, and you talk about the novel, everybody understands a novel differently, because different characters appeal to different people, and different parts of the text speak to different people differently. So in that sense, not only is every translation an interpretation, but every reading of a text is an interpretation in itself. And so you've got this whole idea of there's one absolute set of values, one correct way of interpreting things. This kind of thing is just completely dissolved within the modern world, and all the idea of truth and values has completely dissolved. And so then we have this sort of what's going on at the moment, sort of post-structuralism. So I just want to come back to this in a moment, post-structuralism. Now let's try and think, well, okay, how does the principle deal with this sort of thing? So this is, you know, people often think there's, you know, the principle is the correct interpretation of the Bible. So most unification is also stuck within the European Catholic framework. Our interpretation is the right one. So, but the principle itself is not like that. This is a principle understanding. You have a person, and you have a text, and you read the text, or you look at a painting, or you listen to a piece of music, and then you make an interpretation or a judgment. And then what you bring to it is your life, your values, your purpose of reading the text, how well educated, all these sort of things you bring to the text that you're reading, and you engage with the text, and you form an interpretation of that text. So there's always a subjective element. You can't change the text. This is the thing you cannot change. You know, or you can't change the music unless you're Stalin. When Shostakovich, he was a great composer during the Soviet period, he composed a symphony, and Stalin listened to it, and Stalin picked up the phone and said, I think there's too many notes. Anyway, never mind. So, you know, the text is fixed. It's just you can interpret the text in different kinds of ways. And so there's always going to be this subjective element into everything. So that postmodernist insight that every text is an interpretation, I would say, is correct. That's just the nature of reality. That's the way it is, whether we like it or not. And I would say, yeah, the principle then is able to accept and explain that that's the way it is. Through hermeneutics. This one? You can have the copy of these if you want. Okay, all right. So let's just go on then. Have a look at structuralism. We're talking about going to the post-structuralist era. So this was this person called Ferdinand, another person, Saussure. How are we doing? Saussure. How do I pronounce? That's a French word. Saussure. Okay. Okay. So again, a lot of these thinkers, the postmodernist thinkers, actually they're Jewish. There's a particular reason for that. Because this is a Jewish way of reading the text. So the basic principle of rabbinic interpretation is that for every verse in the Bible, there's 70 possible interpretations. And so that's why all Jews do is they spend their time arguing about the text. They don't change the text, but they're really interested in interpreting the text. And so they argue about it, but they don't, unlike Protestants, they don't separate. So for them, the text is what's core, but the interpretation, there are many different interpretations. They just argue about them.
What do you mean they don't separate?
They don't, they can, within a Jewish community, you have people who have very different ideas about the meaning of a particular passage in the Bible. But they don't divide because of that.
Oh, I see.
It's just become, for them, the study of the text, arguing about the text, is a form of worship. It's a spiritual practice for them to study the text in incredible detail and to argue about it.
It's a way of worship.
Yes, because they're focusing and talking, and the whole conversations focus around the Word of God, studying the Word of God, studying the text, trying to understand it, every little dot and tittle, as they say. That's why they're so good at writing software. And so that's one way. That's very different to the European Catholic traditional Christian view. There's one way of interpreting it. If you don't believe this, you're a heretic. For Jews, there's 70 possible ways, and so it's always an ongoing conversation. So a lot of the post-modernists then, they're secular Jews, atheists, but they grew up in this kind of understanding of the nature of the text and studying the text, and so a lot of them have these Jewish roots. Okay, so this is a structuralist theory. So this is basically, he said, and this is just a typical expression of the European philosophical tradition, talked about a binary opposition is seen as a fundamental organizer of human philosophy, culture, and language. That's just a basic assumption of the European philosophical tradition. There's a binary opposition of everything. I'll explain what that binary opposition is in a minute, just accept that. And so for Derrida then, he critiqued this and he said, actually, this is a violent hierarchy of values. One of two terms governs the other. So, I should have introduced something else earlier. Okay, I'll explain what that binary opposition is first. This is all the way back to Pythagoras, who did geometry, but also he, as a philosopher, is interested in what is the nature of reality. So he drew up categories to make sense of the nature of reality. Is it a fish or is it a bird? You know, the normal sort of thing. Mineral, vegetable, what's the other one? Animal, okay? So he said, when you look at reality, everything falls into one of these two categories. Either there's order or disorder, chaos. Either you have an odd, he was into math, so either there's an odd number or an even number, either you got one banana or you got many bananas, either you turn right or you turn left, either right-handed, left-handed, either male or female, resting, moving, straight or curved, light or dark, good or evil, square or oblong. Okay? And it's called a table of opposites. These are opposites, either one or the other. But also because they have good and evil in this table, that means everything on the A column is associated with goodness. Everything in the B column is associated with evil. So if you look at the word left, for example, okay, generally speaking, in the past, what happened to left-handed people, they were treated with suspicion, somehow crooked, and they had to learn how to write with their right hand. Okay? But also, what is the word, do you know what the word left is in Latin? And maybe in France. What's the word left in French? Gauche. Okay, droit à gauche. Yeah. Okay, in Latin, the word for left is sinister. Yeah. So sinister in English means evil. So the word for left also means evil. That's, again, very deep into European culture. And so all these kind of assumptions, idea that one is better than many, the whole pursuit of European unity and oneness, let's get rid of plurality, let's get rid of diversity, all these things are regarded somehow on the dark side, the evil side. And of course you've got man on this side and woman on that side. And so that's, development, the whole patriarchal kind of tradition and the terrible position of women within European culture until, the rise of feminism, which I'll mention. And so that's, basically the way it was, it has been, this binary opposites. And so this is just assumed to be the nature of reality. All the way from Pythagoras, you can see it in the poetry, the culture, everything. That's just permeates the whole of European culture, that as binary opposites. So Derrida then, he said it's a violent hierarchy where one of the two terms governs the other. And that's correct. And so deconstruction, so this whole process then of deconstructing it rejects most of the assumptions of structuralism and most vehemently binary opposition on the grounds that such oppositions always privilege one term over the other. So throughout the tradition then, you've got A trying to dominate B. Yeah, that's just the way it's been for thousands of years. You know, how easy was it for women to go to university in the 19th century? It's very rare. Yeah, there was almost no higher education for women. All these, many things like that. So if we have a look then at this deconstruction, post-structuralist then, those is okay, so I'll just back up a little bit here. I'm not going to talk about feminism, but okay, so because it was like this, A trying to dominate B, then obviously women very unhappy about this, so you have the rise of the feminist movement, we want to have equality, and then you have almost trying to reverse this kind of binary opposition, get rid of all the dead white males from the curriculum, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you got that going on. So this is an example here. Post-structuralists insist that words and texts have no fixed or intrinsic meaning because you can interpret the text in a multitude of different ways. There's no fixed meaning. There's no transparent or self-evident relationship between them and either ideas or things, no basic or ultimate correspondence between language and the world. I said the only language that corresponds with the world is maths. All the other languages are all social constructs. There's no. So in that sense, because all social constructs are all in that sense arbitrary. Thus, while language has been used to create binaries, such as male and female, and all those ones from Pythagoras, post-structuralist feminists see these binaries as artificial constructs created to maintain the power of dominant groups. Okay, so what do you do then? Okay, we reject the idea of binaries because through the whole European cultural tradition, it's always been one side, one binary dominating the other. Just even in the name, binary opposites. Very different to dual characteristics. The principal understanding of nature, reality, the dual characteristics are complementary, they attract each other, and it's not that one is good or one is evil, but they're just naturally attractive. But even in the English language, sometimes you find when you show people the diagram of the dual characteristics, sometimes the ladies get upset. Why? No, that's positive, negative. Okay, so on the female side you have negative, and the male side you have positive. So if I were to say to you, stop being so negative, Christopher, how would you feel?
Very good. I hate it.
Yes, so the word negative and positive then have two meanings. There's a neutral meaning, a positive ion and a negative ion, positive electricity, negative electricity. They're just neutral terms, it's entirely descriptive. But overlaying that, there's a moral category. Positive is good, negative is bad. That make sense? So where does that overlay come from? Right and left, well, that's just neutral. But there's a moral overlay as well. One and let's unite. Oh, you want to be different. Oh, there's something wrong with that. Where does that come from? So there's just a description of the way things are, but there's also a value judgment which also is deeply embedded and entwined in that description. Where does that come from? That all goes all the way back to Pythagoras, such that we don't even think about it. Yeah, the whole language then is like that. So recognizing this, then the post-structuralists, they say we just want to eliminate the idea of binaries altogether because it's always one over the other. And so that's why we don't have one gender or another. We can have gender fluidity, we can have a whole spectrum, and the whole thing then is dissolved. Yeah, these basic categories that Pythagoras drew up, because they've been so problematic in European culture, they said the solution is to dissolve all the categories. All these categories are artificial because they're all connected to language. All languages are social constructs. And so let's just dissolve them all. Let's try and create a different kind of society where there's total equality and we don't have any value judgments about people's gender or sexuality or behavior or anything else. That make sense? And that's the world we're living in today. It's just a logical conclusion and a rejection of the problems in Greek philosophy. So where do we go from here then? Well, there's different ways. You can either say, okay, well, life was a lot more comfortable in the pre-modern era. Let's all just become fundamentalists. Let's all go back to the texts. Let's just pretend that world does not exist. Let's just hide ourselves away from it. We want to have absolute certainty about everything. We don't want to have someone rattling our cages or the idea there could be an alternative. So back to the Word of God. You see this particularly in Islam, trying to engage with modernity and rejecting it. Go back to sort of fundamentalism and extremism. And also getting sort of neo-orthodox approach, which is like a new orthodoxy, which is, there is a primordial encounter with God, which led to all these things, revelation, everything. But like the sort of neo-orthodoxy, it's like, let's go back to that, but it's just like the shell, without the actual vivid life, without the original encounter which gave rise to these revelations from traditions. So that's a sort of neo-orthodoxy. It's kind of lifeless in that sense. Another alternative is to go for sort of reductionism, which is what's happened mostly. It's secularization, accepting these desacralization. So this idea of desacralization is God being removed from all these different areas. So that's what Nietzsche meant when he said God is dead. Effectively, God is dead because God is no longer present in the public sphere. God is no longer present here. Effectively, in that sense, God is dead. And also recognizing you can't go back to the fundamentalist approach. Nobody's going to go around believing that the world was created in 6 days anymore. Science has demolished all that. But you still find people in America, the sort of creationist movement, the intelligent design movement, trying to turn the clock back to the sort of pre-modern age. And so, have to try and accommodate to modernity according to the scientific, so abandoning lots of religion. Okay, we'll abandon the miracles. We'll abandon this, we'll abandon that. Okay, so basically then, Jesus was a teacher of ethics. This kind of idea. Just remove all the mysterious, remove all the supernatural elements of the religion and just reduce it down to something which works in the modern world. Okay, Jesus was a nice person teaching good things, and if we lived our life like him, then the world would be a better place. And let's leave out all the supernatural aspects. And reducing religion to ethics and reducing everything to human experience, which is what Feuerbach did. Feuerbach, he was one of the most shocking philosophers, German philosopher. And he said, God is a projection. So it hugely influenced Feuerbach. Feuerbach hugely influenced Marx and Freud. God is not real. We just created God. God is a human creation. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, reducing everything down to anthropology.
So Jesus is a teacher of ethics.
Well, that's what they would say. I mean, I would say...
That's what they would say.
Well, that's what they do say.
Interesting.
Jesus isn't God. Jesus isn't the Messiah. He's just a nice person taught a nice way of life. So it's like reducing Jesus down to very human terms, which means you can still be religious because you've abandoned all the supernatural stuff. All communities go through this. Our community goes through this, Okay, I like the principle, that's nice, but, I like that when I was at Sunday camp, but okay, Chongpyeong, let's leave out the supernatural elements and let's just be a nice community, etc. These are kind of challenges. Okay, so how else can we deal with this? Because the secularization is basically, removing all the supernatural divine element out. So alternative approach is what you could say is existentialism. Feuerbach then became kind of also one of the forebearers of existentialism. It is about human existence and about human reality. So here, it's starting from human experience. And so that's like a sort of phenomenological approach. Jean-Paul Sartre, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, they were phenomenologists, concerned with going back to the facts, trying to describe the nature of reality, trying to describe the contents of consciousness, and trying to base everything upon that. So he had, Sartre's book Nausea, for example, trying to describe, what's going on when we encounter this natural world. But then this is very, very open-ended, because it's based upon experience, going back to experience, and then instead of the certainties of the pre-modern age and the modern age, it's more like a journey. So religion then is like a journey, it's like a work in progress. Those of you who heard my lectures, sometimes I say this, for me, my religion is a work in progress. What I believe today is what I believe today, and if you listen to my lectures from some years ago, you'll find I'll be talking about something different. It's like a learning process, a journey. And searching for the authentic experience which lies behind the tradition. So not saying, oh, this is the tradition, therefore I have to believe in it, but actually going back to experience and trying to find what was behind this tradition in which I'm involved and engaged with it. And so in that sense, it's neither reactionary, which is the orthodox fundamentalism, you're going back, reactionary, nor is it revolutionary, which this is, let's just abandon it all, but let's try and find alternative accommodation. So this is my trying to deal with this in that way. So so this is like an existentialist approach to the principle. So, is it marvelous? You haven't heard it yet. Reserve your judgment. All right, so what is our existential reality as a human being? What does it mean to be a human being? Think about it. What does it mean? You're all human beings sitting here on chairs. What is your existential reality? It has nothing to do with God. It's just, what does it mean to be a human being? I'll just tell you the answers here a little bit, because we're running out of time. I've got to finish very soon. Okay, first thing is, we all have a mind and body. Did anybody leave their body in bed? No, because it's here. Did anybody leave their mind in bed? A little bit, okay. Sometimes our mind is somewhere else and our body's here. Basically, that's the first existential reality, is every single human being, whether they like it or not, has a mind and body. Depends how you define the mind. It's this invisible aspect where you're thinking and feeling and imagining and stuff's going on. You have a mind and body. What's the next existential reality of every single human being, whether they like it or not? No?
We need to eat.
You need to eat? Well, that's the third one. Next one is, anybody here created themselves?
No.
No. Every single person here had a mum and dad. True or false? Even if it's a single parent, still there was a dad. A dad was involved in the process. So nobody can create themselves. Nobody until Brave New World comes about actually comes literally out of a test tube and a machine. Every single human being has a mum. That's the nature of reality. Whether one likes it or not, we have parents, and so we live in existence in a relationship with other human beings. And most people have brothers and sisters, and if you don't have brothers and sisters, you have next door neighbors. You go to school, you've got teachers, you've got other pupils and students, you've got shopkeepers. The nature of human existence is we live in a relationship with other human beings, whether we like it or not. And the third existential reality, whether you like it or not, is this. Is the law of gravity optional? Is it? No. It's compulsory. We live in a physical world. Whether we like it or not, our physical bodies have to conform to and are governed by natural law. You jump out of the window and you don't decide, oh, I'm not going to fall, I'm going to float this time. It just happens. That's the nature of life. You eat the wrong stuff, you get poisoned, you eat good stuff, etc. So this is the existential reality of every human being. We've got mind and body, exist in relationship to other human beings, and we live in a physical world. You have no choice about that. That's just the way it is. Anything else? So then, as embodied beings, because we have a body, we also have basic desires and goals in life. So what are the basic desires and goals in life? So if you ask a child, do you want to remain a child forever? What will they say?
Some do.
Well, yeah, Peter Pan. But okay, when they're when they're little children, yeah. When they become teenagers, they start feeling, I want a bit more independence, yeah. So they don't want to be children. They want to grow up. They want to become an adult. Okay, become an adult, then they can make decisions. They can shape their own life and their own future according to their own visions, and they don't have to do what their mum and dad tells them to do anymore. Yeah. So everybody wants that. Want to grow up, become an adult, take responsibility for their life. What's another thing all human beings want? Happiness. How does happiness come? Okay. Everybody wants friends. Most people want to get married, and most people want to have a family, want to have kids, okay? And finally, most people, he asks this to kids at school, what do you want? I want to be rich. I want to have a good job, earn loads of money. Okay? Again, natural desire to live a creative life and to be prosperous and wealthy. As Christabel said, when these desires are fulfilled, it leads to joy. Yeah? So again, these three desires are connected to three fundamental dimensions of human existence: mind, body, relationship with other human beings, and the relationship with the natural world. This is just the nature of reality, the nature of life. And, if you grow up, become an adult, you've got good mind-body unity, you dance, you enjoy dancing, you enjoy sports, you enjoy meditating or yoga or all these sorts of things, life feels good, you're happy, you experience joy. You've got lots of good friends, nice family, happily married, life is good, you feel joy and happiness. You've got a good job or your own business, been living a creative life, you bought your own house, you're prosperous, again you feel life is good. So if you can fulfill these three basic desires, then you feel life is good. True?
My son wants to be making himself, to be very independent of everything by himself.
Good. So then the question is it easy? Is everybody actually experiencing joy in these three different dimensions of life? So sometimes people struggle with the mind-body thing. Sometimes they can't control the physical body. They get obese, look like me. You become alcoholic and start drinking, become alcoholics or drug addicts, and et cetera, et cetera. And then when you're in that situation of addiction, life is hell. Constant craving, constant dominated by the physical desires, and unable to get the mind-body thing right. And, if you're drunk, you don't dance better. People often struggle to get good relationships. So people want to experience joy through love. And sometimes people sometimes people fall in love, they get married, it doesn't work out, they get divorced, they get married, divorced, okay? Sometimes they have kids, they fall out with their kids, they fall out with their parents, they fall out with the next door neighbor, and then they complain, no one comes to see me, I'm so lonely. And you have to think, well, have you ever thought about why nobody wants to come and see you? Because whenever anybody comes to see you, you get into an argument and a fight, and people think, I'm not going to go and visit them anymore. So there's a lot of loneliness in this world. And then people often struggle to manage the world. People earn a certain amount of money, sometimes they spend more than they earn, they go bankrupt, they lose their house, they end up homeless, living on the streets. So if you can't, and that means living in hell. If you can't manage these three, then you can easily end up living in hell. And also people struggle to find the meaning of life. Even if people can get these three right, sometimes they feel there must be more to life than this. I'm healthy, I've got a good family, nice friends, I've got a good job, I have my own house, but there must be more to life than this, some sense of there's a sort of emptiness there at the same time. So people struggle to find the meaning in life. And so at this point, we can start to bring in meaning in life. And this idea that we need help. And this is the idea of needing God's blessing. And so this is this idea that actually through experiencing God, then all these things become manageable and doable in a meaningful, moral way, which leads to joy. So a person talked about this as absolute dependence, this realization, actually, I'm absolutely dependent upon God for my life. Schleiermacher. Did I pronounce that well?
Schleiermacher.
Thank you. Talked about this, okay? And then I don't think any of you are alcoholics, but the best way of overcoming alcoholism is to join what's called the 12-step program. And the point here is realization, you can't help an alcoholic until they want to be helped. And they don't want to get helped until they're absolutely at the total pits when they realize they need help. And the first step is to recognize, I cannot do it by myself. And then next you say, I need help, and the help I need is from a higher being, which we would call God. And then you've got these 12 steps to overcome alcoholism. So that's this idea, which we talk in this language of blessing. What does a blessing mean? I'm going to just a couple more minutes to finish. The Hebrew word, it's a biblical word. Hebrew word is baruch, and it means kneel, bless, praise, or salute. The root meaning is knee. So why do you think the root meaning of less blessing would be knee? What's the weakest part of the human body? A skeleton. Weakest part of the human skeleton is the knee. It's the part that most easily goes wrong and difficult to manage. And when people are frightened, what happens to their knees? Yeah? You go weak at the knees, and your knees start knocking, and everything looks okay here, but really, I can't stop my knees from shaking. That's why usually, lecturers stand behind a podium, so they look like they're fine, happy, and relaxed and peaceful, but you can't see the knees shaking. All right, so why is that? So the wisdom behind this is a blessing from God, is an empowerment to be able to do what is not within our natural capabilities. So without God's grace, without God's help, I cannot stop my knees knocking. Without God's grace, without God's help, I cannot unite my mind and body in a way which means I live a meaningful life. Without God's grace, without God's help, I cannot love my husband, or I cannot love my wife, I cannot love my children, or this horrible person, yes? And so the idea is you offer a little prayer, God help me to love this person, and then you'll find stuff comes into your life to help you to do that. And so this is this idea here of fulfilling what we call the three blessings. So the problem with the divine principle, it starts with God, and then the three blessings that God gave, but actually you should start from human life and human reality. Oh, that's why I need God, because I struggled to get the mind-body thing right. Yeah, that's why I need God's grace and God's help in my family, and then it'll work out much better. And that's why I need God's grace and God's help, so I can manage my business and I can create something beautiful. And the high points of human creativity have been when people like Mozart, Haydn, it's like touching the divine. Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, living incredibly devout spiritual lives, and you can see that expressed in their art. The greatest classics of any art. So in practice, mature person becoming a true teacher, you practice what you preach, becoming a true parent, relating to people, able to connect with all kinds of people, a true owner. And so coming back to the beginning, is there an absolute universal standard then? Well, the universal standard is that murder is wrong. So if you ask any human being in the world, would you mind if I murdered you? Everyone would say, yes, I do mind. There's one thing everybody agrees with, that murdering me is wrong. I might be all right, justifiable for me to murder somebody else because they're so annoying, but it's wrong. So again, going back to human experience, murder is wrong. Because when you're murdered, your mind and body in different places, you can't realize or fulfill the first blessing anymore. Second thing, every human being will accept is that rape is wrong. Nobody wants to be raped. Nobody wants to be sexually abused. Again, because of the incredible internal damage it does in relationships. And again, nobody wants to be robbed. No one wants to have somebody steal their mobile or steal their car or steal their house or anything. So this is like the sort of absolute standard of wrongness. Yeah, there's no absolute standard of goodness, but there's certainly an absolute standard of wrongness, which is universal, every single human being can agree with, because nobody wants to get robbed, raped, or murdered. Even if they want to do that to somebody else, they certainly don't want it done to themselves. And so this universally accepted standard of evil, you can sort of build up a standard of goodness. So, okay, murder's wrong, okay, we can expand that a bit to violence, generally speaking, also mind-body unity. Well, if your mind and body are disunited, that's lying. So we don't think lying is good, so it's mind and body. human relations, no sexual abuse, no adultery. So gradually sort of, build it up a bit, yeah? And you can sort of reconstruct the traditional moral framework, from an existentialist point of view in that sense. And then the question, of course, is, well, okay, that's good. Well, what about the meaning aspect? Why be good? Why follow the law? And so that's, well, it's a way to worship God. Why do people keep the Sabbath? Because they want to become like God. It's a way of inviting God into their life and God's presence there. And then all life then becomes holy. Every act then becomes very meaningful and makes us a better person, and all kinds of stuff going on which we're not going to go into. All right, so way over time by 10 minutes. So can we take
The
a...
Sabbath is primarily Jewish, isn't it?
Who?
The Sabbath.
That's a Hebrew word, yeah. All right, so thank you very much. I meant to leave time for questions. Yes. Yes.
About the goal of life, cause of life, and also that it's not easy to realize these goals. I think about the ideas that we wish to have a good being and bien-être, well-being. But everybody wish that. And the moment there are this idea of justice. I use a great big word, that is to say that we can look to God, to values, a way to create balances between the freedom and equality, because in equality you have not freedom, and in freedom you have not equality. And I like that your model when we see values, interpretation, judgment, creation, person, because it's somewhere something that we can see around us every time.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, different countries have different values, different culture. And you talk about freedom and justice and freedom and equality. In different countries, the balance is different.
Yeah.
Because in different people, some people value freedom more, some people value equality more, and you can say there's no right way that everyone should. One has to recognize, well, they're just different. It's this pursuit of uniformity, which is problematic and leads to totalitarianism. There is one right solution to all of these. That's very deep into the European philosophical culture. Yeah, I agree. You need to recognize there are different ways in which people try to make things work. There's no correct way of living. As long as you don't know murder, rape, robbery, and a few other things going on, there's a whole different ways in which people can develop and live their traditional way of life. And want to live their traditional way of life based upon their own traditional values and customs. And I think the world is so much more interesting when it's like that. Hey, what? Yes, Clive.
This existentialist way of looking at life is very much based on practical. What's practical? How do I come to a point to know God? And if you were to follow those steps, you would end up being a deeply religious, or maybe religious is the wrong word, but someone who has a relationship with God. Mm-hmm. However, that's still only part way, because surely from there you wouldn't then say, how do I become what God wants? You would then say, why did God create?
Yes.
So this is still just a step into what we should be doing. It's not looking from sort of our practical reality, but what God wanted from us.
Yeah, but that's several steps down the line, as you said. So I'm saying, okay, the whole thing's dissolved and disintegrated. How can we start to recreate it? We can't say, well, you have to go back. You can't be fundamentalist. You can't, And so what I'm suggesting, okay, let's start from scratch, the human reality, and gradually work your way up to recognizing, oh, I need God in my life. And then you start to ask the question, as you said, I wonder why God created the universe. And then you're moving into this whole realm of theology. So you're re-entering the tradition, but the tradition not being imposed, you're just starting from your own experience, and then you're rediscovering the tradition, which means in that sense you're actually having the kind of experience that the person who invented the tradition had. You yourself, it then becomes a living tradition as opposed to a dead tradition which has been imposed. It then becomes something living that you've entered yourself and you've been able to understand it from the inside, as opposed to something which you're just conforming to on the outside, which is neo-orthodoxy, is when people just conform because that's what they're supposed to do, as opposed to becoming reinvigorated and re-entering it from the inside. And then you start to, wow, that's really amazing. I never knew that, even though I was told it at Sunday school. Now I've made it my own. This is what I believe because this is my faith as opposed to what I've been passed down. And it becomes alive, becomes vital, and it becomes personal. And that's what it has to be, I think. I mean, our own movement's going through these sort of things as well.
Just from my memories of listening to the Divine Principle lectures and reading is that we are in a state of ignorance, and we need this knowledge of this revelation, whatever it's called, to overcome this. So I'm not sure how to understand this existential viewpoint.
Well, it's just, we're living in a world which is secular. Most people don't believe in God because the word God is very loaded. They don't want to be part of an organized religion. So how do you have a conversation with them? Only a tiny fraction of the people you meet on the street, as it's been for 30 years, are really interested in the question, why did God create? Or what's the purpose of life? They're not interested in that. But what they are interested in is, how can I get mind-body unity? How can I get on better with my husband, my wife, my kids, my parents, drive me absolutely around the bend? How can I, manage my finances, get a good job, and etc. So that's what people are interested in, and gradually from that, then you start to work up to all this theology.
But you said something about this alcoholics, and it's the same in psychotherapy or whatever, that you can't really get any help until you want it, and until you are in this complete bottom, where you ask for it.
Mm.
So it means that connecting to the education, though, do you believe that through education you can help people overcome ignorance?
Well, yeah, that's what goes on in schools every day. One hopes.
But still, people don't understand the need for this.
Well, again, the different ways to teach. If a better way to teach in a classroom is to get the kids interested in what you've got, in what you have to share, as opposed to just telling them all the answers. You have to explain. You get them into a place where they realize, oh, I don't know this. I really would like to know this, and then they start to get engaged with the subject that you want to study. So you have to make them aware of their ignorance. It's like, you can't lead a horse, you can't make a horse drink water, but you can make it very thirsty so that it wants to. And sometimes you have to do that with children. Anyway, I've taken up too much time, so we need to break.